From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And for you today, providing this week's cattle market segment from the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Jim Robb. He'll comment on, among other things, concerning signals on both domestic and export beef demand. Then K-State's Casey Olson will offer us an update on his multi-tiered work on cultural control of Sericea Lespedeza in our Kansas grasslands. From supplemental feeding cow herds to encourage Sericea consumption to late-season pasture burning for Sericea control. And on this week's 4-H segment, two Riley County foragers, Jacklyn Hernandez and Kassandra Moreno, along with mentor Lauren Lauffer, will talk about the first ever 4-H Equity Institute. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. As always, thanks for being along with us. For our cattle market segment to open up the week, we turn now to a senior economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center. Jim Robb is good enough to join us once again. Jim, we have a whole raft of new numbers from the USDA on beef exports and also the department's projection on 2020 beef supply and demand. All of that we'll get to. But looking at this past week's trade, cash-fed cattle dropped yet another 2 or 3 notches, but the futures market seemed to stabilize.
Futures market definitely stabilized, Eric, especially on Friday. We had a nice rebound after, pretty bad erosion in fed cattle and feeder cattle on the futures side. So that was a little bit of a pleasant surprise. And to hold that fed cattle market at that decline, given that the choice box beef cutout was down nearly $7 a hundredweight for the week and actually slipped below a year ago for the first time this year, down on that basis about $7 too. So volume in that box beef negotiated trade, that cash market, was a little bit disappointing. So we didn't sell a lot of beef at lower money, and so that was the meat market struggled a little bit. We had slaughter slightly above last year in the preliminary USDA number and slightly below the prior week's level. So we're near our seasonal peaks in slaughter, but, it's a bit of a struggle in the marketplace. We look at the feeder cattle markets. They were softer across the board. We look at winter livestock was $5 to $6 lower on those heavier feeder weight cattle, and 1,000 pounds and heaviers were $3 lower. Oklahoma City was unchanged to $5 lower. And finally, we seem to be past our, demand for cattle to go to grass for summer grazing programs. So the limited calf weights have also declined. So it's a market that, again, in the face of the wholesale beef market, held together rather well, and the futures did show some life, as you mentioned. So a bit of a mixed week, I guess I would classify it as, Eric.
Well, Jim, what jumps out there is that downturn in boxed beef demand. And at this point of the season, when we think normally of the grilling season ramping up, is that a worrisome thing?
Well, it is a bit worrisome, especially the magnitude of the weekly decline, and that we had been above a year ago, holding together rather well, and we slipped below a year ago. So we do get that seasonal demand profile, but we race along in this seasonal demand increasing period with increasing cattle slaughter, and we're doing exactly that this year. We have quite a few steers and heifers coming to market. So it's a bit disappointing, especially, kind of the magnitude of the decline in the wholesale beef market. Now, that could bounce back, and it could bounce back, too, if we got a little bit of bright light on the international trade side, but we continue to get mixed signals on that front, too.
Well, let's move right into that. For there are new beef export numbers for the month of March out from the USDA. What do they tell us?
Well, they were a bit disappointing. Even in the beef circles, we've had our eyes on the pork market, and in March, U.S. pork exports were down 4% year over year, even in the face of the ongoing expectations because of the African swine fever issues in China that will have an increase. The disappointing point on the pork market was that our exports to three key markets, Mexico, Japan, and South Korea, all declined, and declined significantly. Broiler exports were also down 2% year over year. So now we're setting up for the beef sector, which came in with a year-over-year decline in aggregate on a tonnage basis of down 6%. So that was a weaker level of beef exports than we had anticipated. And we had increased exports to Mexico and South Korea, but the juggernaut and the real factor that was negative were the exports to Japan. Japan, with their new trade agreements with Canada and Australia, et cetera, were apparently being bid out of the marketplace pretty quickly. Not completely, but we're losing some market share in Japan, and it's really starting to weigh on our overall beef exports. So that was a bit of a disappointing month, both on the pork side and the beef side, in terms of export levels, tonnage, in March of this year.
Well, the hope would be that was a one-month anomaly and doesn't become a trend in and of itself. Hard to tell at this point?
Hard to tell at this point, but our expectations are, and I think the market's expectations are, that we will get some trade agreement settlement and some tariff adjustments, and as we move through the year, these numbers should pick up. But the first 3 months have overall been disappointing in terms of total exports in 2019.
Well, Jim, you're loaded up with all sorts of new numbers, and you have data that's fresh now on hay supplies in the Central Plains region, which would be of interest, of course, to the cattle sector.
Well, USDA puts out a hay stock number by state and nationally twice a year, and the number that came out this past week is for May 1, which nationally is kind of the beginning of the bulk of our forage production season. Mm-hmm. Nationally, our hay stocks were down about 3% year over year, and those were the smallest since 2013. Now, when we drill down and look at your region, Eric, very much a mixed bag. Kansas, very much lower hay stocks as of May 1 than a year ago, down 21% year over year. We fed a lot of hay in the winter conditions and the fall conditions. Those are the smallest hay stocks since 2013 in Kansas. But when we look around the surrounding states or the adjoining states to Kansas, Missouri was down 17% year over year, and they had the smallest hay stocks since 1984.
Wow.
So those in the eastern part of your state don't have much chance for some help with hay coming out of Missouri if they need that. Nebraska was the flip side. Nebraska had hay stocks up 53% year over year. That's a big year over year increase. That takes them about to average, maybe slightly below, but a big rebound compared to a year ago at this time. Oklahoma was up 7% year over year. I would call them about normal with a rebound. And Colorado, for those on the far western part of your state, stocks were down 57% year over year, and the smallest since 2012. So it really is a mixed bag. Kansas has tight stocks, which will be supportive of hay prices in the short term. And nationwide, these hay stocks came in a little bit smaller than we anticipated. We expected, with the winter feeding conditions, et cetera, to have fed more hay than normal. We did that, plus a little bit on a national basis. So on a national basis, we're down to hay stocks of a few years ago, and that will be, somewhat supportive of prices running up against lower corn, lower soybean meal prices, et cetera. But certainly something to watch, especially for cow-calf producers, as this growing season unfolds, to see if we can rebuild those stocks going into this coming winter.
And before we leave the subject, one has to think that those lower stocks numbers in various areas, including Kansas, were a direct result of the drought which plagued the region in the first part of 2018. Here you look at the current pasture conditions, for instance, around this state and elsewhere, more than abundant moisture and the prospect for good productivity, so the hay stocks situation could turn fairly rapidly, could it not?
It could, and we look at USDA this past week on Monday put out their first nationwide pasture and range conditions, and those pasture and range conditions nationwide are much improved compared to a year ago. We have only some spotty areas of drought across the U.S. at this point in time. So the overall forage situation is probably a little bit better, I think, as you're implying, Eric, than just the hay stock situation would indicate.
All right. And, Jim, we do want to share your observations from that huge report out from the USDA this past Friday morning. It's the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates, the monthly report, but it contained an outlook on 2020 beef supply and demand. LMIC has put together some numbers looking forward in that respect as well. Would you compare the two sets of numbers?
Well, this is USDA's first estimates of 2020 in terms of U.S. beef production, pork production, broiler, et cetera. So these are numbers we really look at pretty closely. Mm-hmm. And one thing we need to mention on the USDA numbers, especially on the demand side, that they are really limited by policy to current economic environment and what policy is currently in place and tariffs that are currently in place. So if we look overall, we are a little bit more optimistic on exports than USDA can be. And we think this is the right assumption for USDA. They're very transparent that they have to use current policy and not any expected changes in policy or tariffs. Mm-hmm. So taking that into mind. Now on the production side, USDA has slightly more beef production and quite a bit more pork production in 2020 than we are estimating. Now on the export side, again, we have a little bit larger exports. So these wash out a little bit. In terms of the price forecasts on cattle, to focus on that for 2020, USDA is projecting a national average or a 5-market fed steer price of $121 for 2020. That's very much in line with the LMIC's forecast, which is a range of $117 to $124. Those come out about in the same range. So they have a little bit more production, they have a little bit less exports, but I would say on balance, these numbers are probably largely in line with what the industry expected. On the flip side, when we look at corn and soybeans, maybe those numbers came in a little bit larger than anticipated. And so from a livestock perspective, we may get a little bit of help, additional help in terms of these feedstuff costs as we look to the year ahead.
Always a pleasure and always insightful, Jim. Many thanks for your time and your comments.
It's been my pleasure, Eric.
He's the senior economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center based in Denver. That's Jim Robb, offering us that view of the cattle market trends on this Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Researchers here at Kansas State University have been approaching this challenge in weed control in our grasslands very vigorously and from several different directions, and that is the noxious weed Sericea Lespedeza. And today we'll give you an overview of their approaches without the use of herbicides. Rangeland nutritionist here at Kansas State, Casey Olson, has been right in the thick of this work. Casey, you bring this up because you have purposely looked at Sericea Lespedeza and trying to rein it in from these various angles, correct?
That is correct. And, herbicide is our touchstone, our standby when we discuss weed control. But I can think of several reasons why that probably shouldn't be our first line of defense.
And what are those?
Well, number one is expense. The per acre cost for a specialty herbicide is at a minimum about $18 an acre, and that's with a subsidized price. Our compatriots in Oklahoma that have the same noxious weed problems pay twice that per acre. So cost is one issue. Another issue is a sacrifice in biodiversity that's inevitable when herbicide is used. And some of the other plants that are susceptible to our herbicides are really critical for ecosystem function. Things like legumes that fix nitrogen in our soil, plants that bear nectar that feed invertebrates, which in turn feed grassland obligate birds. It's like taking a 3-legged stool and cutting one leg off when we damage that small but critical population of prairie forbs.
Reasons to look in different directions, try things other than herbicide applications. And through various research projects and studies, you have taken on some ideas. And let's start with one of the earlier ones. Looking at supplementing cattle on grass with Sericea infestations with a particular supplement product that may encourage cattle to actually graze Sericea.
Yes. One of the things that stands out biologically about Sericea Lespedeza is it is a high tannin plant. In the wild, what we've come to call wild-type Sericea, tannin concentration peaks at about 20% of the dry weight of the plant.
Which makes it unpalatable for cattle by and large.
Well, number one, they have an astringent flavor, which may deter some individuals from selecting it. But the big hitter with condensed tannins is that tannins will bind nitrogen not only in the plant that produces the condensed tannin, but they will also bind free nitrogen in the gut of the ruminant. We screened a series of compounds that had possible tannin-binding properties, and we used something called polyethylene glycol. There was some published work indicating that polyethylene glycol could bind to condensed tannins and keep the tannins from binding to dietary nitrogen. We tried several things, and the product that looked most promising relative to polyethylene glycol was something called corn steep liquor. It's a byproduct of wet corn milling. At the time of our research, it was about $5 a ton picked up at the plant. It's substantially more expensive than that now for various reasons, but we got a hold of some of this stuff. We gave cattle the opportunity to either select Sericea contaminated hay or clean hay that was a chemical match for the contaminated hay, and half of the cattle got 4.5 pounds of steep liquor a day, and half the cattle got nothing. The animals that got no supplement almost exclusively chose the uncontaminated hay when they had a choice of both things. The animals that were supplemented did not discriminate. They chose equal proportions of the contaminated hay and the uncontaminated hay. So, hey, we thought we had a winner. We took the concept to a production scale research trial that was done down in the neighborhood of Sedan, Kansas, in Chautauqua County. We found a private ranch that had 10 pastures of about 80 acres. We put a full stocking rate complement of cow-calf pairs on all those pastures. Half of them received steep liquor, delivered 3 times a week. It was this is a liquid feed now. It was delivered at about a gallon per head per day, but prorated for 3 feed deliveries a week. The other animals got nothing. At the end of it all, there was a significant increase in the amount of Sericea plants that had been herbivorized, just by looking at individual plants and seeing if they had defoliation. The most important thing, though, was going on inside of the cow. We took some fecal samples and decolorized them and actually identified the microscopic plant fragments. The animals that received no steep liquor selected about 2% of their diet as Sericea Lespedeza. The animals that received the supplemental steep liquor selected about 7% Sericea Lespedeza during August and September. Now, 2% versus 7% doesn't sound like much of a difference, but it's a high enough level of herbivory to allow a measure of biological control. The downsides. Although steep liquor is inexpensive, it requires that you be able to handle liquid feed. Okay, and the setup for handling a truckload of liquid feed runs about $6,000 US today. Number 2, it requires supplementation at a time when we normally don't have to assist our animals on native range. Forage quality is generally fairly high, especially for cows at that time of the year. Those 2 things together were enough of a barrier where we did not see wide-scale adaptation of that technique in the Flint Hills.
Which caused you and your research team to continue looking at other potential control measures against Sericea Lespedeza. And another one of those has been tested as well, using other grazing stock to knock that weed down, small ruminants.
Yes. On that same ranch that we evaluated corn steep liquor, we also evaluated, subsequent to that event, we evaluated co-grazing cow-calf pairs and goats. For whatever reason, small ruminants do not show the aversion to condensed tannins or the digestive effects of condensed tannins to the degree that beef cattle do. When we co-grazed cattle and goats, we had significantly more defoliation of Sericea Lespedeza than we did when we grazed cow-calf pairs alone. So we had something that works and required very little labor. The downside, there's always a downside again. keeping goats would require special fencing, woven wire fencing that was significantly more expensive than a standard 5-wire barbed fence. Our next step, again with an eye to the stocker producer, subsequent to that steer grazing episode in the spring and summer, a custom sheep grazing enterprise during the late summer and early fall. And most of our work was focused on steer-calf growth response and plant community response. With a very limited grazing season of only 60 days at a fairly aggressive stocking rate, we were able to defoliate 92% of the Sericea plants in the treated pastures. In addition to that, the sheep defoliated 100% of the ironweed plants and about 50% of the western ragweed plants, effectively providing control, not elimination, but control of all 3 species. The non-target effects of treatment we were equally concerned with. We did not change peak biomass production at the height of the growing season. There were some minor shifts in plant community composition, but they were in general positive. And for no additional money spent, we got Sericea control without the use of herbicide.
And that brings us then to the latest entry in this lineup of research. We've talked about this before, and we do want you to bring us up to speed on it, if you would, Casey, and that is actually implementing a late summer pasture burn, pulling the cattle off, lighting that pasture up, and seeing if it can put a dent in Sericea seed production, correct?
Correct. We figured, since it's recommended that you spray Sericea with herbicide as it begins to flower, we knew that if we graze it as it begins to flower, that we could limit its seed production and limit its proliferation. Why not try to apply fire? We used an April fire as a positive control, and we evaluated fire around the 1st of August, the end of the stocker season, and around the 1st of September, which would be close to the end of a cow-calf grazing season. We did that project for 4 years, looking at what happens with Sericea seed production, what happens to the physical vigor of adult Sericea plants, and then non-target effects. What happens to biomass? What happens to plant community composition? Every year that we applied fire, we strongly suppressed seed production. We limited its ability to move regionally. Okay, and after we had applied fire for 2 consecutive years, we started to notice a downtrend in adult Sericea plants. We didn't influence total biomass production. We didn't change grass composition. This one is a winner, but we have to train people how to integrate that with a stocker cattle enterprise and with a cow-calf enterprise. We still have some answers that we need to dig out. What's going to happen to yearling cattle performance if we burn in the summertime after the steers leave rather than in the spring before the steers arrive?
That's where you're at currently. You're pursuing that this year, correct?
We were recently funded for a 7-year trial in which we're going to measure livestock performance as a primary metric along with all the other plant data that we've been interested in the past. We intend to be very open about this upcoming line of research year by year. We'll be sharing the data that we generate. If we run into problems, we will report those just as honestly and diligently as the things that we're very excited about.
Fair enough. Casey, you're on the cutting edge of this. Keep up the good work, and we'll have you back for got all important information on cattle performance within this late summer burning system. Thanks for coming over.
Yes, sir.
Casey Olson with us. He's our rangeland nutritionist in K-State's Department of Animal Sciences and Industry. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back with more in a few moments on this, the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggle to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you, and now with today's agricultural news headlines in brief. These courtesy in part of DTN. Well, with the U.S.-China trade deal in danger of collapse, the Trump administration is saying it will begin work on a new program to provide trade aid to farmers, sending a signal to Beijing that the U.S. is preparing for a prolonged trade conflict. Now, negotiations had been close to reaching a deal last week that would have included Chinese commitments to make large agricultural purchases, as well as a roadmap for lowering agricultural tariffs, and possibly other wins for the farming sector, such as regulatory steps that would have allowed China to purchase more crops, pork, beef, and chicken. However, last weekend, China backed away from some of the commitments it had previously made in the deal, according to U.S. officials. The Trump administration, you'll recall, on Friday, moved forward with those new tariffs, raising the duty rate to 25% on nearly $200 billion a year of Chinese exports. The move marks the first escalation of tariffs since September, and China has vowed to again retaliate. Now, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue confirmed on Twitter that a new aid program is underway. Perdue tweeted that he spoke via phone on Friday with the president, who directed the USDA to work on a plan quickly, as the tweet read. One option would be to revive programs from last year, in which the USDA authorized $12 billion in initiatives that were designed to soften the blow for producers. The programs consisted primarily of those one-time subsidy payments to producers of affected crops under the Market Facilitation Program. Many producers said at the time that the payments were insufficient to offset the losses that were occurring from the decline in trade. Even with the program in place last year, national net farm income fell over 16% in 2018 and has been hovering near levels last seen during the recession of a decade ago. And to remind on that point, as was brought up in our session with the Kansas Farm Management Association economists last Thursday here in the broadcast, as we were looking at the new report on 2018 net farm income here in Kansas, the average net farm income in 18 was right at $100,000, but those Market Facilitation Program payments made up fully 37% of that $100,000 average net farm income last year. Based on May the 1st conditions, Kansas' 2019 winter wheat crop is forecast at 323 million bushels. That would be up 17% from last year, according to the USDA in its report on Friday. Average yield is forecast at 48.9 bushels per acre, up 11 bushels from last year. The acreage to be harvested is estimated at 6.6 million acres. That would be down 700,000 acres from last year and would be 94% of the planted acres, below last year's 95% harvested. For comparison purposes, the Hard Winter Wheat Tour, which took place 2 weeks ago across the state, pegged the crop at 306.5 million bushels on the basis of a 47.2 bushel per acre estimate. Want to remind you, cattle producers, once again, there is a major event coming up a week from today here in Manhattan. This is this symposium on bovine anaplasmosis management and control, hosted by Kansas State University's College of Veterinary Medicine. It'll take place again May the 20th, a week from today, at the Hilton Garden Inn here in Manhattan. This symposium is a producer-oriented workshop on the current state of anaplasmosis in the U.S. cattle industry, with an emphasis on Kansas beef cattle production. It'll feature presentations by several national experts on the economic impact of anaplas, the prevalence of it, and its diagnostic considerations, as well as anaplasmosis treatment and prevention, and the veterinary feed directive. A host of speakers will include veterinarians from here at Kansas State University, plus guest speakers from out of state, from the University of Missouri, Bill Stitch, and from the University of Tennessee, Brian Whitlock. For more information on taking part of this, $25, by the way, for registration covering lunch and refreshments, you can go to this web address, KSU VetMed Alumni and Events. That's at the College of Veterinary Medicine website. Go to Alumni and Events, the link there. Or you could call Katie Reif at 785-532-5552, 800-321-532-5552. K-State's second symposium on bovine anaplasmosis. It is set for this coming Monday, May the 20th, at the Hilton Garden Inn here in Manhattan. Producers, we hope you can attend this very important informational session. Now it's on to this week's edition of Tree Tales, and with the edition this time is K-State Forester Shane Neal. Shane?
The Kansas Forest Service and 12 conservation partners have joined together to launch the Water Quality Advocate Network. Kansans rely on federal reservoirs for 2/3 of their total water supply, and this collective effort is a response to the decreasing capacity of these reservoirs caused by sedimentation and streambank erosion due to the lack of healthy streambank forests. This grassroots peer-to-peer mentoring program is a new approach in promoting best practices and increasing outreach capacity. Many Kansas farmers, ranchers, producers, and landowners are already demonstrating best management practices and implementing these ideals in day-to-day operations. The Water Quality Advocate Network seeks to provide a platform, training, and tools to promote these innovative agricultural leaders as examples and more effectively communicate the need for implementing best practices. Further, through advocate stories and experiences, we promote peer-to-peer interactions, mentorships, presentations, on-site visits, and just basic coffee shop conversations about how to start and where to find support and collaboration along the way. The network consists of a group of Kansans who care about conservation efforts, revitalizing communities, creating change to improve our current situation, and providing sustainable resources for the next generation. Other assistance programs available to producers are also promoted by the network. If the need arises to seek cost share or technical assistance, the outreach coordinator will work with the advocates to connect producers with the appropriate agency or program based upon the goals of the individual. The goals and issues of the producer are then addressed from an entire watershed approach, starting with the highest priority. Throughout the entire process, mentors and the outreach coordinator will be available for support and questions. There were 28 advocates who attended the training in 2018, and they have provided nearly 900 volunteer hours. These volunteer hours and mileage of advocates can be compensated when requested by the advocates. The Kansas Forest Service is currently taking applications for future advocates to serve as leaders in promoting water quality. If you are interested in serving in this capacity or have any questions, please contact me at 785-617-0717 or through the website at www.kansasforest.org. This is Shane Neal with the Kansas Forest Service, inviting you to be a part of the Water Quality Advocate Network and share your story and experience with others. You've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Thanks, Shane. Jeff Wickman has this week's 4-H segment next on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. Last month, 4 members of the Verde Clovers 4-H Club in Riley County attended the first ever True Leaders in Equity Institute at the National 4-H Conference Center in Chevy Chase, Maryland. The goal was to prepare 26th youth adult pairs to be change agents within the cooperative extension system as 4-H works to create more welcoming and inclusive environments. Verde Clovers 4-H members Jacklyn Hernandez and Kassandra Moreno, along with Lauren Lauffer, a junior at Kansas State University, member of the First Scholars Program, and a mentor for the 4-H Club, attended the Institute. They join us now to talk about their experience and how they plan to use what they learned to increase diversity within the club. Lauren, you were able to accompany them on the trip. What were some of the things that really stuck out in your mind in terms of the trip?
In terms of the trip, I thought that the people who hosted were really generous. It was a really great event. It was a really awesome learning opportunity for the kids and even for the adults, just to watch the kids bounce ideas off of each other, and it was really encouraging for our future.
What was the main focus of the Equity Institute, the sessions that they were doing?
The main focus was that each group was going to have
their own project to work on that was involving equity. And so that while they were there, they were learning about equity and what that looks like, and just different values that they have in order to make a change in their community by taking their project back and implementing it.
How are we defining equity? What does that mean in this sense?
Equity versus equality is giving everybody the same thing, and then equity is changing what you give them to help them be successful. So, like, you wouldn't give a handicapped person and a little girl the same bike because they're not going to both be able to ride it the same way. That would be equity.
Jacklyn, in terms of what you worked on, what was the area that you guys focused on?
Our project was making our club more diverse because right now we're primarily Hispanic, so we were focusing on, like, trying to include, like, other cultures in our club.
People.
Because you are bilingual, so primarily Spanish would be maybe more your first language?
Yeah.
And you would like then to share your knowledge and what you do and maybe some of your cultures and some of your customs within the 4-H club?
Yeah.
How would you see that working? Was that one of the things you talked about, was how to accomplish that goal?
In our project, we also had to, like, come up with how to get to our goal. So one of the ways we thought we could make our club more diverse is, like, talking to the different clubs that there is in the high school. Like, we have a German club, and then we have a French club, and we can, like, get more people to want to come to our club.
Lauren, from your perspective, how would you suggest that they come back and implement some of the things that they talked about?
I think just keeping the communication open with each other and then having the boldness to reach out to other people that are around them. Because right now they are a multicultural club, but the majority of them are Hispanic. And so just, like, being able to step outside their comfort zone and, like, reach out to other people to emphasize, like, the culture in their club.
You both had to write an essay as part of the application process. What were some of the things that you talked about or highlighted in your application letters?
Well, like, on my application, I kind of talked about how my family how they lived in Mexico, like, how different they live here in the United States. They have more opportunities and, like, more jobs that they can do, not like in Mexico, and how that changed their life when they were here for
So the fact that they had opportunities
Yeah.
here that didn't exist there.
Yeah.
What about you, Jacklyn?
In mine, I kind of talked about, like, college and, like, how it has to do with my family. Like, for example, there's some people who, like, go home every day and their parents ask them, like, what they want to do, and, like, it's a typical, like, topic they talk about. And in my family, we don't, because none of my parents went to, like, college. So I never got those opportunities that most people get until, like, I joined 4-H, and I started learning more about, like, college and, like, ways to get, like, scholarships and, like, learn about it.
How did 4-H prepare you to take a trip like this? Because I would think just going on a trip like this could be a little bit intimidating. I know it would be for me to be out in Washington, D.C.
Well, we would get together and, like, have meetings and talk about it, talk about our project, prepare ourselves for that.
Are you satisfied with the trip? Did you have a lot of fun? Was it something that you would suggest other people in the club try and do it themselves if they can?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we learned a lot from that trip, and I feel like if other kids from our club would go, they would really enjoy it and learn how we learned, and in some way, like, change our lives, how we have a future ahead of us.
You feel like there's more opportunities out there now that there are things that you can accomplish. You can go to college and you can be whatever you want to be.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I feel like on that trip, I learned a little bit more of what 4-H actually is, because I never really understood what 4-H was. And on this trip, like, I felt like I knew more of what it was.
What do you think it is now?
Altogether, I feel like it's just a place where you can be yourself at. And honestly, just, like, it's a big family.
Well, like, some of, like, the speakers that talked at the convention thing, like, they would talk about, like, how one of our speakers was Rivera. He was, I guess, when he was younger, he would do, like, not good things. And I guess in some, like, he noticed that it wasn't good for him. And, like, he changed, like, noticed that there was more opportunities. And he, like, I guess now, like, he travels the world and talks about his life And I feel like that's really cool, and it can impact a lot of kids who go to those conventions and change their lives and want them to, I guess, like...
What was the interaction like between you and other 4-H members? Did you kind of feel like you were on the same field, that you kind of had shared some of the same experiences?
I feel like most of the 4-Hers that went there already had like more experience with 4-H than us.
They were like in the club longer than we have. And
you have a fairly new club, right?
Yeah. And they've been to like more conventions, so they know like what they're doing and stuff. And since we were new at it, we were like, we really didn't know what to expect. And
I think what's next is like actually putting our plan in action in our club and like talking to them about it, the rest of our club, to see what they think about it.
And get their ideas and change it and make it better.
That's Kassandra Moreno and Jacklyn Hernandez. They're both members of the Verde Clovers 4-H Club in Riley County. They recently attended the first ever True Leaders in Equity Institute outside Washington, D.C. Kansas State University student and a mentor to the 4-H Club, Lauren Lauffer, also attended. To learn more about Kansas 4-H, contact your county or district extension office or visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.